Alright, so now that we have a pretty good understanding of the overall architecture and we saw the MVP app in action, let's go ahead and figure out how to spin everything up from scratch, starting with the core. And just a little heads up before we get started, for this tutorial, I actually have a little cheat sheet, a Google Doc on the right side of my screen that I have all the commands already. However, I plan eventually on updating the readmes right here, right on the repo. Now, I don't know if I'm going to have time to do that before I publish this video, but either way, to save you all time from, pretty much just let you copy the commands from some document and paste them in so I don't have to type them all out manually. Just go ahead and check the description below and there'll be some guide there, either to a Google Doc or a README. And on that note, let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing that we need to do is spin up an EC2 instance. So I assume that anyone following this has a basic understanding of AWS. If not, I'll try to take things a little bit slow. But go ahead, if you don't, sign up for an AWS account and go to this EC2 section right here. And I'll just go to instances running, although there are a couple different locations you can launch a new instance from. But anyways, find this launch instances button. And what we are going to do first is just give it a name. Now, the name of this repo is core, and I already have a server named core. It's for the new Boston network, but I'm just gonna call this core. Let me just call this core 2. This name doesn't really matter. It's just so in AWS you can pretty much differentiate your servers. Pretty much just give it a label. And then down here, I'm gonna click on Ubuntu. Actually, I'm gonna click Browse More AMIs. And what we are looking for is Ubuntu Server 20.04 HVM 64-bit right there, and make sure that it's the x86. And all right, so got that selected. Scroll down here, T2 micro. It's one of the smaller ones, but that's fine for us. Keep here, login. I say that like I'm Canadian. Keep here. All right, what key pair do I want to use? Let's go with this one, Bucky iMac. If you don't have a key pair, then go ahead and, wow, my Canadian accent's really shining through here. But if you don't have one, you can create one right there. And let's see what else we need to do. All right, so down here, we're gonna just click some settings for the security group. In this one, allow SSH traffic. Of course, we wanna be able to shell in. And also allow HTTPS and HTTP. And the reason that we need both of these is because before we have our certificate, we're going to need to pretty much reach out to the service and communicate with HTTP. However, after, to get a secure connection from TNBOS and the client, we're going to be using HTTPS. So anyways, just make sure you have both of those. And that should be it. All of the other defaults are good. We only want one instance. Let's launch this bad boy. Alright, successfully initiated launch of instance. Let's just go ahead and click this to check it out. And if you select this, then your details will pop up below. And right now, it is pretty much booting up, pending right here. So it's going to take a minute or so. I'm just going to pause the video and I'll come back when everything is up and running. Alright, so that took about 10 seconds, very snappy. And now that we have it up and running, I'm just going to go ahead and copy the public IP address. And then I'm going to open my terminal. And to connect to it, SSH Ubuntu at that IP address. Enter, yes. And all right, good to go. Just clear the screen and okay. So just a little background on what we're doing. Let me pop Chrome back open. So like I said before, this software is written in Django. However, it uses some other services as well. For example, it uses Nginx and Postgres for the database. And I mention all this because before we can just install the software straight up, we need to install Docker. Now, once we have that installed, we can then pull down the Dockerized version of this. And all of this is already set up, good to go. We already built it. So either way, just want to give you a little heads up of what we're doing here. And for this next step, what I'm going to be doing is essentially going through this guide, the official Docker guide. However, there are some things in here that you can kind of skip over. So instead of just following along with this, since not everything applies to our environment, I have a little cheat sheet that I'll just go through, but I say that because if you ever get lost or maybe something's out of date from this tutorial, then I would refer back to the Docker documentation of installing Docker Engine on Ubuntu. All right, so let me go ahead and plop open my terminal and let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing that it recommends is uninstalling any existing versions of Docker, and this is going to report that it's unable to find them. That's okay. This is pretty much just ensuring that we don't have any existing versions installed already, just what we want. Now let me go ahead and clear that out. Now, before we install this for the very first time on this host machine right here, what we need to do is we need to set up the Docker repository. And this is just going to allow us to communicate with Docker, install and update Docker. And before we do that, our famous, kind of the famous Ubuntu setup, we're going to make sure we have the package cache updated and we upgrade all existing packages. So let me just wait for this. All right, so that took about a minute, I would guess. Now, after everything is updated, I'm going to go ahead and run this command right here. And what these packages do is they allow app to use a repository over HTTPS, which of course is the Docker repository. And all right, nice and easy. Now, after this, we can go ahead and add Docker's official GPG key, which is going to allow for the secure transmission of data. So first, we're going to make this directory and then run this command to pull it down or download it. And all right, once that's set up, we can use this command right here. And what this command does is it just finishes setting up the repository. So now that we got that taken care of, let me go ahead and clear the screen. And one thing that I saw, and I don't know if this is necessary, but I figure it doesn't hurt, is I'm going to go ahead and update the app package index again. Again, I'm not sure if that's necessary, but I saw it in the documentation and, well, I figure it didn't hurt, so might as well just go ahead and do it. And after this, I'm going to go ahead and install the latest version of Docker Engine and some other things such as Docker Compose that we're going to need. So let me just go ahead and do that. Shouldn't take long. And by the way, kind of a plug for my other tutorial series. If you are not familiar with Docker or you want to learn more, like what is Docker Engine, what is Docker Compose, I highly recommend checking out my Docker series. And all right, once that's done, go ahead and clear it. Now, at this point, we should have Docker Engine, Docker Compose, pretty much everything set up. We can go ahead and first, once everything is installed, go ahead and start the Docker service. And okay, we didn't get any errors, that's good. And now we just want to verify that everything is set up properly by running a simple hello world image. So go ahead and run this command, hit enter, and if everything works properly, again, it's going to pull it down since it doesn't have it in cache already. And it's going to say hello from Docker. You should see that somewhere. That means we are good to go. Now, another thing that happened that I didn't really discuss, kind of happened in the background, is that right now Docker Engine is installed and running. And what also happened is a group called Docker was created, but no users were added to it yet. Now, we are going to need that group, and what we need to do is we actually need to add your user to the Docker group. So we're just going to go ahead and add to group the user that you're using right now. And once you do that, we can go ahead and exit, and then we want to pretty much shell back in to make sure we got all the updated permissions. So I'm gonna exit, clear, and then just shell back in. All right, so now that we're back in, we should now have permissions for the Docker group. And at this point, we can now pull the actual images that we're gonna need for the core repo. So the first image that we're gonna pull, we're actually gonna pull down two of them. The first one is pretty much the source code or the server that you would think of, pretty much all that Django code. And while this is kind of pulling down, just to talk to you about the other image that we're going to be pulling down, that's our reverse proxy. And that's going to be essentially the Nginx service that sits in front of our code. And yeah, that's pretty much all I have to talk about. Anything else I can talk about while this is happening? Oh, I got a story for you. So I went to Dunkin' Donuts probably about a month ago. It's November 10th now, probably at the beginning of October. Check this out. And here, let me go ahead and okay, let me go ahead and pull this. Again, this is the Nginx service basically. And I'll go ahead and run this and then I'll finish my story. So, oh man, that was way too quick. Okay, I'll tell you at the end, the Dunkin' Donuts story. It's pretty incredible as far as, how exciting can a Dunkin' Donuts story get. But, a lot of people complain when I tell stories in the middle of my tutorials. Just thought I had some more time there. All right, so now we should have both those images pulled down in, we can actually just verify that if we type in Docker images. Of course, we have that hello world one for testing, but all right. Now, before we do any more server setup, what we first need to do is we need to associate an elastic IP address with our EC2 instance. So why do we need to do that now? The reason that we need to do it now is because this core is going to be using HTTPS. Now, as part of the additional server setup, we need to have a domain name ready to pretty much configure all our SSS certificate, encryption, so on and so forth. You'll see in just a bit. But just to make it super clear what's going on right now, I went ahead and I paused the video and I made this little 2-second diagram to show you what we're doing. So we already have our EC2 instance. We are shelled into it. Boom, good to go. And yes, I know these IP addresses aren't valid. They're just examples. I just didn't want anyone to yell at me for it. Okay, so we have our EC2 instance, and what we can do if we wanted to is we could have a domain name set up and we can just point that domain name to this instance. For example, whenever someone went to thenewboston.com, they could just hit our instance. And that's fine, it's gonna work, at least for the time being, so on and so forth. However, the problem with that is whenever you have an EC2 instance, the public IP address associated with that instance is not static. In other words, if we ever stop this instance and restart it, AWS is going to assign it a new public IP address. So that means we're going to have to go back in our pretty much our DNS configuration, update it to a new IP, and it's pretty much just a pain. So instead, a much better solution to avoid all these headaches is using something called an elastic IP. And what this is it's basically an IP address that's tied to a reserved or static public IP address. And with this, we can point this to any EC2 instance that we want. So the setup that we're eventually gonna structure, whatever you want to call it, is that we're gonna have a domain name and we're always gonna point it to an elastic IP address that we're gonna create in just a second. And this IP address is never going to change. And for this IP address, we're going to point this to our EC2 instance that we just created. And whenever this instance gets restarted, or maybe we just want to deploy an updated version of our code, we can even do something like this. We can point it to our new instance, and everything is, it's just a much better way so your IP addresses aren't changing all the time. The IP address, of course, that's associated with your domain name. So if this is confusing, you're going to see exactly what we're doing in a second. It's really not that bad. So go ahead and pop back in your AWS EC2 section. And on the left-hand menu, if you scroll down to this network and security section, you're going to see a link that says Elastic IPs. Go ahead and click that. And once you do, you're going to see this big orange button right at the top right that says Allocate Elastic IP Address. This basically just means create a new elastic IP address that I can use. Now, all of these defaults should be good. And let me just make sure. Yep, looks good. Now, after this, just go ahead and hit allocate. And all right, so this is kind of, I thought it took some time, but apparently not. So this is your new, again, this is an elastic IP address that we can use. Now, before we actually hook this up to our EC2 instance, what I like to do is rename this. And what I prefer is naming it the same thing as my EC2 instance. And I named my EC2 instance Core2. And so I'm just going to name this Core2. And there you go. So once I have this elastic IP and I gave it a name, right now, it's pretty much like this. It's not linked to any instance at all. So what we need to do is we need to associate this elastic IP address to our instance, basically the equivalent of creating this arrow right here. So how do we do that? Well, go and make sure that it's selected, and then under actions, you'll see associate elastic IP address. And what we want to do is we want to associate it with an instance, and the instance is, you can find it by the tag actually, core2, right there. And just to make sure I got the instance ID correct, B8BF, and yep, instance ID B8BF. So then, actually, before we click associate, we do want to make sure that this is checked right here. Allow this elastic IP address to be reassociated. And what this just means is if we ever spin up another instance, for example, let's say we updated our core code, then we can just go ahead and pretty much just reassign it. Well, I don't even think I need to explain. Reassociate it is like the best word to describe it. So make sure that you associate with an instance, make sure this is checked, hit associate, and then those two are essentially going to be linked together. Now, the cool thing about this is that's really all that we need to do. And in fact, to test this, what we can do is we can actually SSH in to this instance, but instead of using the instance's public IP address like we did before, we can actually just use the IP address from this elastic IP, and we should be able to shell in to our instance from that. So what I'm going to do is copy this elastic IP address, and then just to make sure everything is working, back in my terminal, I'm going to go SSH Ubuntu at, and again, this is the elastic IP's address, which should, if everything worked properly, allow us to shell into our EC2 instance. Beautiful. All right, so our elastic IP is now hooked up, and let me pop my diagram back open. So what we essentially have is this setup right here with an elastic IP tied to our instance. But now, as kind of the final step, we need to get a domain name and point this to our elastic IP. So to do that, let me actually keep this tab open. And in this tab, since we really don't need to do anything with our instance directly anymore, I'm gonna open Route 53. So this is kind of AWS, anything you want to do with domain names. And I believe from here, if you don't have any domain name, then you can go ahead and, you know, type one and go ahead and register it. I believe it usually costs like $5 or $10 a year. And the reason that I'm not going to go through this process is because I already have quite a few domain names from, you know, previous projects and tutorials, so on and so forth. But either way, this process is pretty simple. Just pick a domain name, add it to cart, click next, next, next. It may take an hour or so to set up, maybe a little bit longer, but eventually, once you have one purchased, then you can go to hosted zones on the left right here. Now, a hosted zone is pretty much just Amazon's Route 53 concept of a collection of domain names or a collection of records. Now, let's see what one I can use. How about this Fataxia.io? So I believe that this is the one that I was using in the earlier videos. However, I deleted the EC2 instance from it. So this is pretty much just the same as if you were to buy a domain name for the very first time. So once you have it, go ahead and click on it. And what we need to do is we're going to be updating the A record for this domain name. Now, just to kind of give you a very basic understanding of what these different records are, you would think, you know, you have a domain name, you just need to link it to an IP address. So what the heck are all these other records doing? Well, the A record is the most easy to understand. This, actually the A, I believe, does stand for address, and it just links this domain to an IP address, and I believe it has to be IPv4. Now, we aren't going to be touching these other ones, but, you know, like I said, just to give you a quick understanding, this NS record right here, it specifies the authoritative DNS server for the domain. Again, you really don't need to tweak it at all. And this SOA one, this stands for start of authority, and it just has some additional like admin related information about your domain, like the email address of the admin and like when the domain was last updated, so on and so forth. But either way, make sure that you only are tweaking the A record. And for this, we pretty much need to edit the record to point to our elastic IP. So this elastic IP, what we just shelled into, I'm just going to go ahead and copy that again. Make sure it's copied. And then again, go to your record, make sure you have the A record selected and no subdomain. We're just going to paste in this, which is the address, the IP address of our elastic IP. And then all that should be good to go. All right, so now this is pointing to 44 yada yada 139, 44 yada yada 139. And this may take some time to actually update. So let me find a tool online real quick. All right, so this looks like one I used before, DNS checker. I'll just go ahead and do that. Show notifications, absolutely not. So let's check it out. And this is just making sure that everything is up to date. So when I put in this address right here, vataxia.io, what I'm hoping to see is this elastic IP, which is going to end in 139. So I'm just going to go ahead and paste in this URL. We're checking the A record. I'm just going to hit search. And yes, it looks like that was actually a lot faster than I anticipated. But yeah, everything's good to go already. Now, to kind of verify that everything is working with our domain name, what we can do is, just like we did right after we associated that elastic IP, we can try to SSH into our server again, but this time we are going to SSH in using the domain name. So that domain name was vataxia.io. So in here, let me just go ahead and open up a new tab. And let me minimize this. Looks a bit hard to read. There we go. SSH Ubuntu at vataxia.io. All right, so I'm getting this warning that said, like, pretty much warning you're being attacked, something went wrong, but you probably will not see this warning. The reason that I did is I already have this domain name of vataxia.io. I already pretty much taught my computer that this was associated with another IP address. So since I just changed the elastic IP, that's why it's like giving me all these warnings. But again, you shouldn't see this. Let me just go ahead and fix this. All right, looking good. And if anyone ever gets that error, just know that there's a file on your computer called known hosts, and it pretty much has all those associations built in. So if you ever change one, you pretty much just have to delete what it knows or delete that association, and then you can pretty much just shell in again. But either way, that was an unexpected part of this tutorial, so let's get back on track. So at this point, we have our entire structure set up, and let me just make this a little bit more realistic. I'll say our domain name, which is vataxia.io. Everything is linked properly. And the last step that we need to do now that we do have that domain name is we need to go ahead and pretty much set up our software. And by the software, I mean this core repo right here. And as part of the setup process, whenever we run this script that we're about to run for the very first time, it's going to automatically set up our SSL certificate, enable HTTPS, all this encryption, and start everything up. So we already wrote a deployment script. Actually, let me see if I can find it right here. So in core/deploy.rst, it goes over a lot of this. But what we are looking for is a command, probably somewhere near the bottom, right here. So again, this is where we are. You want to copy this command, bash. And what this is going to do is it's pretty much going to pull down our deployment script from this repo and just run it on our server. So copy that, bash, hit enter, and okay, the domain name, let me make sure I got everything copied correctly. So it's going to ask you for some info. The domain name is vataxia.io. Beautiful. Email address. And this is needed for certbot, which is just the bot that pretty much just sets up our SSL. And okay, now it's doing its thing. And by the way, this is also set up to renew your SSL certificate, since even when you go and set up a certificate for your domain name, you need to periodically like renew it basically. And it's kind of a pain if you do it manually, but we already have logic in here that renews it after, I forgot how often you need to, but it already handles all that for you. So pretty cool. And here we see certbot is requesting our certificate, and it looked like, okay, successfully received it, yada yada, everything's good to go. Looked cool. Core API is up and running. Beautiful. So at this point you can go to vitaxia.io/admin, and you should have this blank admin page right here. Now, if you're familiar with Django, you know that this is going to take you to the admin portal. However, in order to get there, you first need to create basically an admin user, aka a super user. And to do that, we can use this command right here. Again, this is going to be all in the documentation description below. But Docker compose, pretty much shell into our software, run the manage command to create super user. And you can just call it whatever you want. Okay, username, I'll say Bucky. And my email address, you don't need that. Enter the password. All right, super user created successfully. And once that is done, pop open Chrome again. And Bucky and log in, and beautiful. All right, and that is all we need to do to set up our core. We are now ready to connect to it using TNB OS. So if you haven't already set up TNB OS, actually let me go ahead and clean up some of these tabs. They just annoy me when I have too many. Close tabs to the right. All right, so go to the new Boston developers GitHub. Again, this is going to be in a link in the description. So either click on the link below or find the TNBOS repo. And again, this is super easy to set up. Just pull it down, make sure you run npm install, and then just run npm start to start the project. And as you saw, I already have this little npm start hooked up to this play button right here, but this is pretty much just the equivalent of running npm start. And then if we wait a few seconds, then it's gonna pop up. Let me minimize this so everyone can see. All right, so this is already hooked up to a couple networks, as you can see. Like I already have a bunch of data in here, but just to kind of simulate what it's going to be like the first time for all of you running it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click this dev button and I'm going to do clear store, and this is pretty much just going to wipe out all my existing data. So now if I go ahead and just quit this and reopen it, I will be at the same stage as all of you. All right, so beautiful. Minimize this and check it out. So the very first time that you open TNBOS, you're going to be greeted with this prompt right here, and it's going to give you your account number, which, as you know from the first video, is just pretty much the ID associated with this device right here. And the first thing that we need to do right after this is we need to copy that account number, because in order to send messages on the network, this account, it needs to have messaging credits. So if we, let's say, go to this network right here, we can, well, let's just go ahead and add this network first. Now, when adding a network, your network ID is going to be the domain name. So vitaxia.io, the protocol is HTTPS. You don't need the port, actually. This is kind of a UI thing that I need to improve. But since we have HTTPS, it's going to default to 443. And the display name is just what do you want to call those messaging credits. You can call them credits, you can call them, you know, things, whatever. I'm going to call mine VTX. I usually like to call mine something, you know, just so I can more easily remember the network. And for the logo, let me just go ahead and steal. All right, let me just copy this image address. All right, looking good. So now you can tell by this little green indicator right here that I am indeed connected to the network. However, right now I have a balance of 0. That means I'm connected, the server is working properly, everything is good, but I'm not going to be ugh, got phlegm in my throat. I'm not going to be able to send any messages right now. So in order to send messages or add messaging credits, again, I just want to make sure I have my account number copied, because what I'm going to do is hop back in Django admin, and under my accounts, I'm just going to add this account right here, and I'll give it a balance of really whatever you want. We'll say 10,000 right there. And when you hit save and continue, actually check this out. You should see your balance update in real time. You don't need to refresh it or restart the app or anything. And let me just show you real quick that that does indeed update. Let's say I change this to like 25,000, save and continue. You can see on the left side of the screen, it updated just like that. And the reason that this is updating is because this is actually connected to our core through WebSocket, and we don't need to like refetch everything. Any changes to this account is automatically pushed down to TNBOS. It's pretty cool, and there we go. So if you want to go ahead and test everything out now, then you can install this software on another device that you have at home, maybe a laptop or something, and then share this account number with that, add it as an account, and well, you already saw how the chat application worked in the last video. However, since we're going to be creating an app with a speed test, we're going to be getting into all that anyways. So I figured I'd save it for another video. But point being, once you have your network hooked up, see that little green dot and see your balance right here, you are good to go. So that was a great video. I had a great time. I don't know about y'all, but in the next video, we'll get started on creating that speed test app. Looking forward to it. I'll see you then.